Stanford University.
Let me welcome you. My name is Kelly McGonigal. I am your hostess for this party we're going to have this quarter. I'm really looking forward to this. I was so excited when Continuing Studies asked me to invite my favorite psychologist at Stanford to come here to speak with you and speak with me so that you can really have an opportunity to see all of the amazing work that's happening by psychologists and by allied scientists, including neuroscientists and some folks from the School of Business, and what contemporary psychological science really looks like today and how it can be applied to answer personal questions and social issues. So to kick things off, I thought we'd play a little trivia game. Now here's the deal. You're playing for chocolate, for dark chocolate. So if you don't like dark chocolate, you can keep the answers to yourself and let someone who does want the chocolate win. The other thing is you're going to use a little bit of self-restraint here, so we don't all call out the answer at once, but you'll raise your hand and I'll recognize someone with a little gleam in your eye and I'll call on you. So let's go with the first one here. The simple question, who is this famous psychologist? Everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding of ourselves. I did see a hand right away. Who is this? No. It is. It's Carl Jung. Okay. Good work. They're applauding you, but they're also a little bit jealous. That's why the applause wasn't that strong. Okay, now while you're gonna pick the one you want while I show us the next. Okay, guys. Wait. Okay, but at least wait. Hands down. At least let me read you this quote. The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer despite my 30 years of research, is what does a woman want? What does a woman want? You can answer either question. Who is it? Who is it?
It's Freud.
It is Freud. Good work.
I don't know what a woman wants.
Anyone?
Oh gosh, thank you very much. Oh, almonds.
Almonds, all right. Okay, next up, they're going to get a little bit harder, but I think let's see. This one may be the hardest of all. Aren't that many famous female psychologists from the history of psychology. But this woman said it is difficult to hold an open mind over an extended time, and yet that is what is required of the scientist. And it is required also increasingly of the ordinary citizen in this age. So true now as when she said it. Who is this famous psychologist? Now, I see a hand in the back. Yes, you. No, it is not, but good guess. No, but also good guess. Pink. Yes. No! Yes, you. No. Okay, folks, are we just guessing women from psychology? No, okay, stop. Does anyone actually know who this is?
I think it's Mary Curie.
No! Was she a psychologist? Okay, wait, last guess before I give you a clue. No, okay. Think strange situation. Now does anyone know who it is? It is, it's Mary Ainsworth. Good job. Take your pick. Here, grab them all, or you know what you want? Okay. Okay, next up, a Stanford psychologist. Who's that? You in the middle. It is Phil Zimbardo, the early days. Do you want peppermint in dark chocolate or extra dark chocolate? Okay, great. Will you pass this back? All right, guys, one more. This one, I don't know. But a really excellent point of view. Every social problem is in part a psychological problem. The job of the psychologist is to define the psychological element in social problems and to create interventions that target this element. Who is this famous psychologist? Greg Walton, yes, congratulations. Woo. Who I will be introducing formally in just a minute.
Thank you.
Peppermint or dark?
Oh, dark, please.
There you go.
Thank you.
Good. I got the one I wanted, too. You guys are so great. You left me the flavor I was hoping would be left. Okay. So before I introduce Greg Walton to you, just to remind you of the format of this course, every week we're going to have a different guest lecturer who's going to speak to you for about an hour about their work. Then we'll take about a 10-minute break a little bit after 8 o'clock. After that break, I will be interviewing the lecturer on stage, a little conversation about how their work might relate to interesting problems in the world or your personal life and other interesting things like that. And then after maybe 15 minutes of that, we'll turn it over to you for you to ask questions or make observations or comments about the things that you've heard. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Greg Walton, who is a professor of psychology here at Stanford and also did his undergraduate work in psychology at Stanford when I was a graduate student. I mean, you've come a long way. He's best known for his research on academic interventions, stigma, and stereotype, but he's also done work on a wide range of topics, including willpower, which I know some of you are interested in, voter turnout, stereotypes, social influence, and how it is we construct a sense of identity, how it is we know who we are. He also was recently named a rising star by the Association for Psychological Science, and I think we're going to have a really great lecture.
It is a pleasure to come and talk with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts at the end, as Kelly said. The research that I'm going to talk about with you today and the ideas originated really in my youth as I grew up. I grew up and I was a perhaps young and naive child, and I thought it was such an amazing, wonderful thing to live in a country like America where there was such a thing as meritocracy, as an American dream, where people could rise up from different places and better their economic lives, improve their lives, to advance themselves, who could immigrate as poor people potentially, and have their children have a better life than themselves. And at the same time, as I was really committing myself to this ideal that I think all of us believe in a very deep way, I was aware of the massive inequalities that exist in our society between different social groups, the reality that many people perhaps don't have a fair shot. Many children go to schools that are poorly funded, that are ones that don't provide them the opportunities to grow and expand as other children have those opportunities. I was particularly troubled by inequalities that arose along racial and ethnic lines. It seemed particularly an injustice, a social injustice, that some people in our society, because of their ethnic or racial background, had worse outcomes than others. I became aware, for example, of data like this. So what we're looking at right here is reading scores. These are reading scores among white youth. These are 17-year-olds and these are 13-year-olds. This is the National Assessment of Education Progress, our so-called nation's report card. And what you see here simply is that kids learn from age 13 to 17. But then if you break this down along racial lines, here's African Americans, 17-year-olds and 13-year-olds, and you see that black 17-year-olds are on average reading at the level of white 13-year-olds, a 4-year gap in the teenage years, in years when kids should have these opportunities. I find this deeply troubling. A second thing that I find deeply troubling here is that the gap has, not really changed. We're looking over data since 1971. Our country has gone through great changes since 1971, and yet here in 2008, the gap remains similar. We can look as well at Latinos, Hispanic youth, and we see a very similar outcome. Now, and just to underscore the way in which our society has changed in particular, there's big education policy changes that have happened in this period. We had in 1965 the beginning of real strong federal role in K through 12 education through the ESEA Act, as well as through Head Start. These are undoubtedly important programs, and yet the achievement gap remains. In 2002, we had a bipartisan bill that passed and that President Bush signed, the No Child Left Behind Act, that is now being modified, and yet the gap, this has drawn increasing attention to gaps of all sorts between different students, including racial and ethnic achievement gaps, and yet these gaps remain. Now, as a child, who grew up simultaneously with this belief in this ideal, this dream, this American dream, of opportunity, and an emerging awareness of the persistence of inequality, I became very, very depressed, I think. And I became depressed because it seemed like, it really seemed like to my sort of young eyes that the only way you could make meaningful progress in solving a problem like this was really to eradicate poverty. That really these racial and ethnic disparities occurred because there's profound inequality in economic opportunities. Schools are funded in ways that are not equal. Teachers are paid in unequal ways. We have incentivized teachers to teach in the well-off schools that might more often than not have fewer minority children. And then I encountered psychological research. And in learning about social psychology, I saw a new way of thinking about problems like the achievement gap, a new way that I think has great promise. So this idea of a psychological approach to this problem, a psychological approach to achievement gaps, begins with a couple of observations about the nature of the achievement gap that are curious. So one is it's true that poverty matters. Kids who come from poorer families with fewer books at home when they're young definitely have a disadvantage. They do worse in school. But nonetheless, at every income level, we still see race differences in achievement. If you compare the children of black doctors and the children of white doctors, and you look at how they do on a test like the SAT, you see a reliable gap. You see the white kids getting better SAT scores than the black kids. Now, why is that? When you might think, well, it might be something to do with preparation, prior ability. It might have something to do with maybe the worst schools, maybe racial discrimination in the schools that these kids went to. And these things matter too. The kids who are better prepared, kids who come to college with better preparation, for example, get better grades in college. But still, at every level of prior preparation, for example, at every level of SAT score, race difference exists in subsequent achievement. If you compare students at a school like Stanford who are white and black and have the same prior track records, same SAT scores, same GPAs in high school, you still see emerging in college, or perhaps re-emerging, a race difference in GPA. So what is going on here? So what social psychologists have done in investigating this problem is to really zero in on the psychology of students and the psychology of students that can result in specific local education contexts. To make that, I know that wasn't very clear, but to make that a little bit more clear, what this suggests here, this clicker is not really working. What this suggests here is that even when you take the same kids who have the same prior preparation, the same qualifications for college, and they come into a college environment, there's something in that college environment that's doing something that's causing that race difference to reemerge. There's something in that environment that's not equitable, that's not the same for different students, that's allowing some students to perform better than other students. So this is where we get to psychology and how psychology matters. And thinking about psychology can give us new tools to reduce achievement gaps. It gives a new way to understand the origins of achievement gaps and new tools to combat them. This is particularly what this means is to think about what is it like to be a student in class, or what is it like to be a student who's taking a standardized test. If you're sitting in the third row and you're surrounded by your classmates and you're looking up at your teacher, what does that feel like? What is that experienced as? And how might that be different, potentially, for different students? This research has emphasized the press of social stereotypes, the pervasive stereotypes that exist in our society that say that some people are smarter than other people, that say that white people, maybe Asian people, are smarter than racial minorities, than African Americans, Latinos. These stereotypes have effects on people. They have effects on people's experiences in education settings, and they have effects on how well people ultimately perform. This idea, this notion of the press of stereotypes, the press of disadvantage, can find its expression potentially as well in another major social problem we see, and that is the problem of of pervasive inequality in health outcomes between African Americans and white Americans, between Latino Americans and white Americans. This was a story in the Yale Alumni Magazine this past May and April. This is civil rights attorney Clyde Murphy. Clyde Murphy was a very prominent and successful civil rights attorney. He argued successfully civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. He was a member of the Yale class of 1970. He was born in 1948, and he died in August 17, 2010, last year, at the age of 62, of a pulmonary embolism. If you look at the data from the Yale class of 1970, they represented 3% of the class. And if you look at who is now deceased, they represent 11% of the deaths to date. And many of these men, these are men almost exclusively, are dying of things that are stress or stress-related sort of broadly, things like heart disease. This is undoubtedly a great tragedy. And it's one where perhaps, again, by stopping a moment to think about what it is like to be a person in a setting, what is it like to be a person in a setting where other people may view you with suspicion, where other people may perhaps begin by assuming negative things about you or your group. What is that like? What does that do to a person? What does that do to a person's performance and achievement? And what does that do to a person's health over a period of time? So social psychological research, so this, I want to, sorry, I was just ahead of myself there. So I want to sort of try to bring this home for you a little bit and think about what my experience might be like on a cross-country road trip, what it might be like to go into a setting and experience a stereotype that's targeted at me. So I live in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is a liberal place. I am a professor, a position that is stereotyped in our society as sort of liberal and kind of weak and whatnot. So suppose I'm driving cross country. I'm somewhere in the middle of the conservative Badlands somewhere, and I see this biker bar, and I think, man, I am hungry. I need to stop. I need to go in. I need to go into this bar. I go into this bar. It looks like this. Suppose I start talking with some locals, and they say, "You're from San Francisco? San Francisco?" And then they say, "You're a professor? You're a professor?" Now, what might be going through my mind? I might think, what are these people going to think of me? Are they going to think well of me? Are they going to think badly of me? If I do something stupid, are they going to think I'm an idiot? If I do something stupid, are they going to think that liberals and professors and people from San Francisco are idiots? What if they challenge me to a game of darts? Say there's a dartboard in the bar, and they say, hey, why don't we play darts? Hey, why don't you go first? Right? Am I likely to hit the dartboard? Or this is to take our story to Texas. This is a story that was a real story, a true story. We have a PhD student who's graduating very soon. He's originally from Texas. He's a Texan. And he's going back soon to Texas to take an academic job at UT Austin. He went home this summer to Texas to go to a wedding. A friend of his from college was getting married. And the pre-wedding event was skeet shooting outside of Austin somewhere, up in the hills, somebody's ranch or something. And apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently there's a belief in Texas, a sort of gospel of faith that you're a Texan, if you're born and raised in Texas, but you leave, it's kind of like cell by cell you get replaced, and you sort of become no longer a Texan. And so he's there at this skeet shooting event, and they've organized into teams. And he's on a team, and he's going to shoot first, and he has to shoot at these things, right? And they all start ragging on him. They say, "Hey, California boy, bet you can't shoot, California boy." So what's that like? You're standing there, and it's not just that they're saying that you can't shoot. They're saying, you non-Texan, you California boy. They're putting this stereotype on him in this category that he belongs. He's suddenly not a person anymore. He's just a group token, a token member of a group. And when he shoots, do you think he can even hit the sky? I mean, I don't think I could hit the sky at that point, just like I couldn't hit the dartboard if I was in the biker bar. So we can all think of stereotypes that apply to ourselves, groups that we belong to, our geographic group, our gender group, our racial ethnic group, our religious affiliation, our professional group memberships. We can all think of these identities, and we can all think of contexts or ways in which these identities are negatively stereotyped, where there's negative stereotypes about them. And we can imagine ourselves in situations where these stereotypes come alive, where we feel that press, we feel that push on ourselves, we feel subjected to it, we feel reduced to it. All our doctoral student is in this moment is the California boy. He's lost his individual identity. He's nobody else. He's just the California boy, and California boys probably can't shoot. So we can feel what that's like. What social psychologists have done is to try to bottle that in the laboratory, to really understand that in the laboratory, to see what that does to a person, and then to take that insight, put it in the field, and see if we can make the world a better place. To bring it back to racial stereotypes, this is Rodney Ellis, who's a state senator from Texas, coincidentally, who talked about the experience of racial stereotypes about intelligence. I knew I was just as intelligent as everyone else. For some reason, I didn't score well on tests. Maybe I was just nervous. There's a lot of pressure on you, knowing that if you fail your race. Our own Claude Steele, the dean of the education school and a longtime professor in the psychology department, has termed this stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is defined as the fear of being judged or treated stereotypically, the worry that a negative stereotype might be true of the self, or that others might think it so. That if you miss that dartboard, if you can't shoot well, suddenly people might think that that stereotype is true. Professors, people from the Bay Area, we're weak, we can't throw darts, we can't shoot. And this can cause anxiety and distraction. It can undermine achievement. And I just want to return to the point, because we are going to be talking a lot about stereotypes that racial and ethnic minorities face. But I want to really make clear that this is something we all feel, we all experience in situations in which some group that we belong to is targeted by a stereotype. Some context that we're in where a stereotype about a group we belong to comes to the fore. So in early research in the 1990s, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, who's at NYU, decided to test whether you could reduce stereotype threat, and if this would potentially improve the performance of students who are negatively stereotyped in an intellectual context. I just want to sort of bring us back a little bit to this context. This is a radical hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that you could actually raise people's academic performance just by changing the psychological context they're in when they take the test. And when I was a kid and I was starting to think about these things, I thought, wow, I thought it was all about poverty. I thought poverty was really the be-all and end-all determinant. And could something like psychology, just how you represent a test, potentially have an effect? This was their hypothesis. They took Stanford undergraduates, and they had them take a very difficult GRE verbal test. They manipulated the relevance of the stereotype. So they had some people take the test in a context in which the stereotype was relevant and could be used to interpret their performance, and other people took the test where it was not relevant. So for some people, they were told that this test is diagnostic of verbal skills. This is going to evaluate your verbal ability. They didn't have to say the word stereotype, but they assumed that that would cause the stereotype to come to mind, this worry that potentially if you were to perform poorly, it might confirm this view that maybe African Americans have worse verbal skills than others. The rest of the students took the test, and it was just described as a laboratory exercise. This is a psychology study. We're interested in puzzle solving, so we're gonna do this laboratory exercise. OK, so here's the results. If you look at the performance in the diagnostic test, you see this whopping race gap. Black students performed a lot worse than white students. And if you look at it on the non-diagnostic puzzle, the race gap is entirely eliminated. So then they thought, well, how subtle is this? How far can you go? So in the next study, they manipulated whether people were asked to indicate their race before they took the test, or they were asked to indicate their race after the test. Now, if you're asked, OK, you're going to do this thing, and first we want to just ask you some information about yourself, please check off your race. it's logical to conclude that your race is somehow relevant to the next thing that you're going to do, that maybe people might interpret your performance differently depending on your race. So they reasoned, Steele and Aronson, that this might cause stereotype threat. And that's what they found. They found that you got this large race gap in academic performance, again, on a verbal GRE test when people were asked to indicate their race. But again, no difference when the race question came after the test. Moving the demographic question to after the test eliminated the race difference. In fact, field research suggests that this could also be an effective strategy to reduce, for example, gender differences on the AP Calculus test. But that's another story. OK, so as I just alluded, this is not just relevant to African Americans or other racial and ethnic groups. This is also relevant to all of us, including women in math. Women face a pervasive stereotype that women have less mathematical skills than men. Steve Spencer, Claude Steele, and Diane Quinn tested this with undergraduates at the University of Michigan. Their participants were women and men who cared deeply about performing well on a math test. They were people who were potentially math majors, the people who you would want to do well on math so they could fill our need for engineers and mathematicians, scientists. The manipulation was a little bit different. Some people were told that this test it yields gender differences, like most math tests. And other people were told, oh, this test is actually a special test. It's specially designed to be gender fair. Men and women perform equally well on it. When people were told that the test yielded gender differences, you get this gigantic effect. Hey, California boy, bet you can't shoot, California boy. It's the same thing as saying, oh, this test yields gender differences. Now, go take this test, young woman. But when people were told that the test didn't yield gender differences, same exact test, there's no gender difference at all.
So this had a positive effect on men's scores?
Yeah, so this difference between the two green bars is not significant in any one study. But if you collapse across all the data, it is a significant result. So what that means is that calling to mind the stereotype, even when it's done in a subtle way, not explicitly, it hurts the stereotyped group. But if you know that some other group is on the downside of that stereotype, some other group is going to be viewed with suspicion, you yourself perform better. It's called stereotype lift. So stereotypes exacerbate group differences in two ways. They push down the performance of the negatively stereotyped group, stereotype threat, and they lift the performance of others, typically of men and whites. OK. Now, an important step is to step back from the immediate testing environment, the environment in which you're taking the test, and consider more broadly what stigmatization or being under the scrutiny of a stereotype does to a person. This is the sociologist Irving Goffman, who wrote a long time ago in the 1960s, "The central feature of the stigmatized individual's situation in life is a question of acceptance." Now, if you feel that you are, if you in an academic setting, if you're a woman in an engineering program, if you are an ethnic minority student, an African American or Latino student in an academic setting, you may wonder, perhaps more pervasively and more constantly than others, how people will treat you in that setting, what that will be like in that setting, if people will respect you, if people will value you in that setting. Just as if I walk into the biker bar and I think, who are these people? How are they going to view me? How are they going to treat me? Are they going to be decent to me? Are they going to respect me? Or perhaps will they not? If you're part of a group that's under the pervasive suspicion of a negative stereotype, perhaps especially if you're a member of a group that's numerically underrepresented in a setting, if you're a woman going into an engineering environment, there's lots of other women, it might be fine. But if you're a woman going into an engineering environment and you're the only woman, that might be more likely to cause you to wonder if other people will accept you. We see this in the testimonials of some prominent people. This is a woman who graduated from Princeton University. My experience at Princeton had made me far more aware of my blackness than ever before. No matter how liberal and open-minded some of my white professors and classmates try to be toward me, I sometimes feel like a visitor on campus, as if I really don't belong. It often seems as if to them I will always be black first and a student second, a token of a group. Does anybody know who this might be? Yes, it's Michelle Robinson, now Michelle Obama, writing in 1985 in her senior thesis at Princeton. Obviously, she's somebody who has been very successful in her career, has done exceedingly well. And if people who are as successful as Michelle Obama experience this kind of thing in an environment like Princeton, it suggests that this worry may be very pervasive. This is Sonia Sotomayor at Princeton about 10 years previously. I'm not picking on Princeton. These are just the good examples I have. At Princeton, I felt like a visitor landing in an alien land. I have spent my years since Princeton at law school in my various professional jobs not feeling completely a part of the world I inhabit, a sense of being apart, not being fully connected, not really being integrated into the social, the main powerful academic and professional environments that she has done so well in. So this idea is one that I think we can all, sorry, let me get to that in a second, we can all empathize with and relate to in context, different contexts potentially in our own lives. What it does, I suggest, is if you are constantly wondering, if you walk around with in the back of your head this question, what do other people think of me? Do I belong here? It leads you to view that social world differently. So here are some events that college students experience. These are actual events experienced by college students, and in surveys, a lot of what people report having happened to them on a daily basis is social, and a number of the social events are negative. These are things like, everyone is going out without me, and they didn't consider me when making their plans. My teacher canceled her meeting with me. My usual friends weren't at dinner. Not getting an email back from a peer. I felt bad. I haven't gone on any dates in college. Not being recognized at awards dinner when I deserved it. Dumped by a girlfriend. My boyfriend didn't call. People also, of course, say things that aren't necessarily social, like I'm working on a paper that's due tomorrow and I have writer's block, or something like I found a dead mouse under a pile of my clothes. The woman who reported this particular incident also told us that her boyfriend had gotten rid of the mouse. They'd spent a quality time together that evening, so it had a certain social quality. Now my point is this. We all, when we go about our daily lives, when we go about our daily lives in school, in our professional settings, we all have positive and negative experiences like this. This is sort of the bread and butter of daily social life. There's nothing extraordinary about these things. And yet, if you are constantly wondering a more global question, if you're constantly asking yourself, do I belong here generally, these events might come to carry a different meaning. If you are going about your daily life, and part of you in the back of your mind is asking, I'm not sure if I belong here. I kind of feel like an alien in an alien planet here. I feel different. I feel like I don't quite fit in. I don't know if people respect me or value me. Then if something happens, like you send an email to a peer and you don't get a response back, that might feel like it might feel diagnostic. It might feel like, that's proof of my suspicion. It's proof that I might not belong here. If you're not having that worry, if you don't have that question of belonging, then it's still a negative event. These are all no doubt negative events, but it might not carry that global meaning. So this is an idea that we termed belonging uncertainty, a pervasive uncertainty about belonging, especially for students from underrepresented or negatively stereotyped groups. Questions about belonging may be pervasive. They may be more pervasive than for others. And what this does is it ambiguates the meaning of negative social events. That is, when a negative social event happens, it raises the prospect that maybe it means more. Maybe that event has a global meaning. It might mean I don't belong in general. And if you in turn infer a threatening global meaning, if you infer from the fact that your friend didn't write you back on your email, if you infer that you don't belong, you can imagine how that could set in motion a negative recursive cycle. Your friend doesn't write you back, and then the next time you see your friend, you say, hey, why don't you write me back? Or maybe your friend doesn't write you back, and then you just decide that's no longer your friend and you stop engaging with that person. Either way, you might lose friendships in that setting. You might actually substantively start to have weaker social ties in that environment. And that, in the long term, in an academic and professional setting, might be very damaging. Now, we looked at this in a very simple way in a small study I want to describe to you before I describe a field experiment, an intervention field experiment. In this study, we just had black and white college students. We asked them to list 2 friends of theirs or 8 friends of theirs that they had who are either in computer science or who would fit in well in the field of computer science. So your task is simple. All you do is list 2 friends or list 8 friends who would fit in well in the field of computer science. The question that the study asks of participants is, what does this difficulty listing friends mean? So for all of our participants, it was easy to list 2 friends. Everybody had no problem thinking of a couple people who would fit in well in computer science. But for everybody, for all of these participants, they didn't really have 8 friends. It was hard to call to mind 8 friends who would fit in well in computer science. What the study tests then is, does it mean anything that you experience difficulty listing those 8 friends? Does that mean anything? Yes or no? So it turned out for white students, the answer was basically no. Listing 2 friends or listing 8 friends, it didn't matter much. This is their self-assessed potential to succeed in the field. It's on a percentile scale. In both cases, they're saying about 45th percentile, a little bit lower than their classmates in terms of their potential to succeed. For black students, so there's this whopping effect, both when they listed no friends in a control condition we added for them, and when they listed 2 friends, they were pretty optimistic. They felt positive about their prospects for success in computer science. But when they had been asked to list 8 friends, and they experienced that difficulty seemed to mean that they didn't belong. It's a small thing, a subtle thing, but it seemed to be answering the question they had, do I belong in this field? And it seemed to answer that question in the negative. And not only that, it wasn't just that it seemed as though it doesn't belong for me. It also, we also found that it seemed that difficulty of listing 8 friends seemed to mean that my group doesn't belong here either. So this is a measure of the cognitive activation of race, how accessible were racial constructs. For white students, they were not very accessible. But when black students had been asked to list 8 friends, all of a sudden, race seemed to pop into the mind. Suddenly, race seemed relevant. We didn't do anything, we didn't say anything about race beforehand, but here, race seemed to be relevant. And then we asked people one more thing. We gave them some statements from peers who were expressed interest potentially in majoring in computer science and in another field. And we asked people to write a note, a peer feedback note to the student, either suggesting that they pursue computer science or not. White students are pretty encouraging in both conditions, encouraging of a same-race peer. They were also encouraging of black peers. But black students, although they were encouraging of a black peer to pursue computer science when they were in the non-threatening conditions, when they hadn't had that difficulty, when they had the difficult task of listing 8 friends, suddenly they started to discourage their same-race peer, their black peer, from pursuing the field. Suddenly, it felt like this isn't a field for me. It's not really a field for people like me. It's not right for us. So this is the kind of small social threat, this difficulty of listing friends, that can be very reasonable and very adaptive in many contexts. In contexts where people can really experience prejudice, where people can really experience negative stereotyping, it's very important for people to be sensitive to subtle cues that those negative things may happen. But they can also have these deleterious consequences for something like academic motivation. So what we decided to do next was to try to change these inferences, to change how students respond to social adversity in school. That is, to change the meaning of negative social events. We couldn't change the negative social, we can't make everybody's life be a bed of roses. We can't actually make everybody experience just positive stuff. But we wanted to try to change how people think about the negative things that will inevitably happen to them. So we decided to try to do an intervention in the field to change how students understand social adversity in school. And we wanted to know, would this raise minority students' achievement? Would it potentially set in motion a self-sustaining process that might improve students' outcomes over time? Maybe this would improve health, too, potentially. Maybe developing a sense of being more integrated in the school setting to feel like you belong more in this important social environment. Maybe that might be relevant to health. We know from a lot of research that one of the most important predictors of positive health is positive social relations. A very serious predictor of poor health, for example, is loneliness. So here, by trying to help students feel more secure in their belonging in this important setting of school, we wanted to see maybe this might have effects on health. So this is what we call the social belonging intervention. And again, it's designed to specifically to prevent stereotype students from globalizing negative experiences in school as evidence that they don't belong. We can't prevent negative experiences from happening to people, subtle negative experiences. People are going to have those happen. That's part of life. But we want to prevent them from having this broad global meaning that's broadly threatening. This is what's called by psychologists an attributional retraining intervention. That is, it's designed to change the attributions that people make for negative events. So if our participants walk into the study are assuming that when something bad happens, the reason why it's happening is because they don't belong in general, we want to change that attribution and make them attribute the negative events or negative feelings they have to something innocuous. So our participants were first-year college students. And they learned that doubts about belonging in college are common at first and short-lived. So they saw some survey statistics, and they read some representative quotations that were attributed to an ethnically diverse group of juniors and seniors. One of the quotations said, "Freshman year, even though I met large numbers of people, I didn't have a small group of close friends. I had to remind myself that making close friends takes time. Since then, I've met people, some of whom are now just as close as my friends in high school were." This says everybody goes through tough times. The transition to college is a hard transition. Everybody has negative things that happen to them. Everybody has, difficulty making friends, difficulty making close friends, difficulty finding their academic niche or making relationships with an academic setting that they want to pursue. Everybody has different kinds of difficulties, but people have difficulties. It's hard. And it doesn't mean you don't belong. It doesn't mean your group doesn't belong. If you stay with it with time, eventually you'll come to feel at home. Now, this intervention, it's not one that is going to blind people to racism that exists in the classroom, for example. It's not one that's going to make people unaware when real racist incidents happen. It's just designed to take the edge off negative events that are subtle in their meaning, to prevent them from carrying this global threatening meaning. There were a number of different control conditions. For example, some students learned that peers' social political views became more sophisticated over time. Some people learned that peers get used to the physical environment in college over time. And importantly, we didn't just give people this information. We didn't just say, here, take it. Take it and live your lives. We delivered this idea that everybody worries at first about their belonging, but it gets better with time. We delivered it in a very impactful way. The intervention only lasted an hour, but it was a powerful hour. So in both conditions, we reinforced the message using what are called saying is believing techniques. So students wrote. They wrote for about half an hour about how their own experiences in the transition to college. They wrote for about half an hour about how their own experiences in the transition to college illustrated the themes that were emphasized in the intervention material. So students in the intervention condition, this is at the end of their freshman year, they wrote about how they too worried at first about their belonging, but how this got better with time. And they believed, moreover, that these essays would be delivered to next year's freshmen in orientation to help improve their transition to college. Then they delivered their essay as a speech to a video camera. This was a large and imposing 1980s-style video camera. And it was designed to make our participants really feel the impact of their words, to really endorse this idea, to connect it to their own experiences. This is a way in which to make our students believe themselves to be benefactors rather than beneficiaries. This is not an intervention in which people are told you are now going to receive an intervention. We did not want to stigmatize our participants in that way. That could obviously undermine the treatment message. And we wanted them to connect it to their own lives and feel the importance of that idea by expressing it to an audience that they cared about through the saying is believing tactics. Okay, so let's see what this did. We tracked our participants from 2 different cohorts over 3 years. Again, the intervention was delivered in their freshman year. We tracked students through senior year. And the first thing that you see, this is black students in the control condition. is, I think, a very, very troubling line. This is a flat line. There's a little dip, a little recovery, but essentially this is a flat line. Students, African-American students in the control condition started off in college getting about a 3.5 GPA. They ended in college getting about a 3.4 GPA. And students are taking classes with all different class years, and yet there's no growth over time in their GPA. By contrast, the intervention condition participants showed this term-by-term improvement in GPA. Every term they got better. They were on a positive trajectory. It didn't just, the intervention didn't just simply put students at a higher level. It changed the trajectory of their performance over time. For white students, there's a slight rise in both conditions. If you collapse statistically for white students, you see them slightly rising over time. But there's no treatment effect, because for white students, the intervention is not addressing a worry that's pervasively on their minds. They don't have to deal with the possibility that other people might not like them, that they might not belong by virtue of their racial identity. It's just not simply a problem that they have to contend with. If you look at the achievement gap, you see over that 3-year period, this intervention delivered freshman year cut the achievement gap by half. Because the intervention has the effect of changing trajectory over time, the effect's largest later in time. So it cut the achievement gap senior year by 79%. So this is very encouraging, because it suggests, for example, that by understanding the psychological dynamics that people go through for very reasonable and, when we stop to think about it, perhaps very predictable reasons, we can do things that can have real effects on this pervasive social problem. If you look at how the effects are distributed across the class, you see that the intervention condition is associated with a very large increase in the percentage of students who are in the top 25% of the class in improvement in GPA. It's associated with a dramatic reduction in the percentage of African-American students who are in the bottom of the class in improvement in GPA. If you just look at raw post-intervention GPA, who's at the top of the class rank, you see that there are very few African-American students in the top of the class in the control groups, but in the belonging treatment group, there's about 22%, which is what you'd want, given that we're looking at the top 25% of the class. And similarly, the intervention is associated with the reduction in the percentage of black students who are in the very bottom of the class. So the effects are widely distributed across the performance distribution. They're helping students go into the top of the class and stay out of the bottom of the class. Now, what's going on? How possibly could an intervention that's delivered freshman year stick with students and help them do better even senior year? How could that possibly be the case? Well, you might ask, to start, maybe students remember the intervention and continue to benefit from this memory. Maybe it's like, junior year, you're studying for that tough midterm, you think of that kind of nice, reassuring message you got back in freshman year. Now, that's ridiculous, right? That's totally ridiculous. So when we did a survey with students at the end of college, right before they graduated, 80% of them said that they remembered the study back freshman year. We've asked them to tell us what they learned in the study. 8% could learn. We asked them, did the study have any effect on you? 14% said it had had any effect. This intervention totally rearranged students, the African-American treatment condition participants, totally rearranged their college experience, improving it for the better. And we know that because of our random assignment to condition. And yet, for all students in all races and conditions, they're saying it had no effect on them. It's not happening through a conscious process. It's not happening because people are just consciously thinking differently. Instead, what it does is it protects students' sense of belonging in college. It helps them to continue to feel that they belong even when they encounter those inevitable slings of daily social life as a college freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. So this gets a little bit technical. I'm going to try to make sure to keep it as conceptual as possible. But what we did is the first week after the intervention, we asked students, we wanted to ask the question, how did students respond when they experienced relatively high levels of adversity in school? So we had them complete these daily diaries. Each day, people told us how good or bad their day was, how much adversity they had encountered. And each day, they told us their feelings of belonging, both that same night and the next afternoon. And then we simply calculated for each participant over the course of the week the correlation between those things. That is, for each participant, when you experience more adversity, do you feel worse? Do you feel like you belong worse? That's the question. OK, so this correlation indexes the degree to which people's sense of belonging goes up and down as you experience good and bad stuff. OK? Here are the results. For white students, essentially the answer in both conditions is they're not related. That is, when white students experience good events and when white students experience bad events, they reported similar levels of belonging. Their belonging was not sensitive to these daily events. But for black students in the control condition, there's this very strong negative relationship. When they experienced bad stuff, the more bad stuff they experienced, the worse they felt about their belonging. The bad stuff seemed to carry this meaning, seemed to imply when you emailed somebody and they didn't write you back, it made me feel I don't belong. And the intervention entirely eliminated that relationship. So no longer did these negative events cause this up and down fluctuation. And statistically, this mediated the improvement in GPA for African American students. That is, this process, this psychological process, statistically accounts for that boost in GPA observed over the next 3 years. And you can think about that. You can think about what that's like. If you're wondering if you belong, and then something bad happens and you feel you don't belong, and then maybe you're sort of constantly feeling up and down about your belonging. You feel you don't belong when something bad happens. Maybe you respond in a way that doesn't facilitate building better relationships. That might ultimately sap you of the social and psychological resources you need to really achieve well. OK. So here's an example of this. This is a black woman in the control condition who wrote, "Everyone is going out without me, and they didn't consider me when making their plans. At times like this, I feel like I don't belong here and that I'm alienated." Everybody experienced the first sentence to the same degree. People experience this kind of thing in college. I think we've all been there. The intervention targeted this inference, and by changing this inference, it raised students' grades. What about health and well-being? Well, we assessed in this end of college survey people's happiness, their self-reported general health, their recent doctor visits, and we see these similar positive effects. This is happiness. The intervention increases black students' happiness. If you feel like you belong in this very important environment like college, it's not surprising that you're going to perhaps be happier. People's self-reported general health, this is a very standard scale. It's predictive of important outcomes. See the same effect in the control condition. There's this race gap. That is, black students report being less healthy than white students. But the treatment eliminates that race gap. We look at recent doctor visits. Again, no effect for white students, and a large effect for black students. Here, interestingly, it's the black students in the treatment who report far fewer recent doctor visits than any of the other groups. So let's step back and think. Imagine, what if we could get effective psychological interventions like this to students everywhere? This isn't the only psychological intervention that can reduce racial disparities in academic achievement and over long periods of time. There are several others. Imagine if we could get interventions like this to students everywhere. Could we reduce the achievement gap on a national scale? Could we have a meaningful impact at a large level? Could we increase the number of women in science and technology and engineering? Could we improve the performance of students who are targeted by negative stereotypes everywhere? Could we improve people's health and well-being? Might this be a more effective approach to reducing racial disparities in health, perhaps, than some others? Could we expand economic opportunities? Could we help to make more real the American dream, to make more real the opportunities that all children should have? How would you do this? How would you scale psychological interventions? I'd be happy to talk about these issues more, but in brief, I want to just say a couple things here. One is, you want to first ask what should be scaled, and the answer is the key psychological message that is targeted by the intervention. So the intervention has a whole bunch of parts to it. There's that speech part, there's that writing part, there's all these different parts to it. But what's, am I doing this?
I don't know, it's been on and off. It's a cell phone thing. Somebody's cell phone.
It's a cell phone? So, you know, you can easily do a psychological intervention in a hollow way. You can do the same exercises, but if you're not actively targeting this key psychological message, the idea that, in this case, the idea that everybody worries about their belonging, it's not about you, it's not about your group, and this too will pass, and you will come to feel at home in this school, that when something negative happens, it doesn't mean you don't belong. If you don't target that, then you're not actually delivering the intervention. How do you deliver psychological interventions to more students? This is work that we are working on now with my collaborators and my students. You can try to train teachers to deliver psychological interventions. This, of course, has the blessing of potentially being delivered by the people who are interacting with kids and have skills to do that. It also has the downside that potentially teachers may not know how to do it or know how to do it well, or perhaps may do it poorly. You can develop ways to deliver psychological interventions in controlled contexts, for example, online through online interventions, another approach that we are working on. Okay, psychological interventions are not silver bullets. These are interventions that are not simply separate from the structural issues, the economic disadvantage that I talked about before. If we want all children to be able to achieve to their potential, we have to both remedy psychological inequality and structural and economic inequality. If this was an academic context in which the teachers were terrible, students didn't have opportunities to learn, it doesn't matter what the psychological intervention is, it's not going to have an effect. A psychological intervention is not going to teach kids how to spell if the teacher isn't actually there teaching them to spell. What the psychological intervention can do is remove barriers that's preventing the kid from benefiting from the good teaching and good curriculum that the teacher has. So structural and psychological reforms are both necessary and they're complementary. It's also essential to use experimental methods to investigate educational reforms generally, but in psychology in particular. If it wasn't for the experimental methodology, we wouldn't be able to say that the intervention had these causal effects. Now, I want to close by addressing one final implication. I began by showing you these large and pervasive group differences in academic achievement. And research on stereotype threat invites us to think about these disparities in another way. The traditional interpretation is that when we see group differences in academic performance, when we see men get better math grades than women, or African Americans drop out of school more than whites, we usually assume that these entirely reflect real differences in students' ability. That is, the reason why women are getting worse math scores than men is because they're worse at math. But stereotype threat and issues of belonging suggest that group differences might in part reflect systematic biases that prevent minority students and women from performing as well as they are capable. That is, when we look at how well people do on a test like the SAT, or what kind of grades they get, maybe there are systematic biases in these environments that originate from stereotypes that cause people to perform less well than they are capable. It's like a runner who's running into a headwind, a psychological headwind here. And you're running as hard as you can, but you might not be able to perform as well as you could if that headwind were not there. So how do we know that this is the case? We know it's the case because if you look at settings in which stereotypes have been taken off the table through randomized experiments in laboratory settings where you have conditions that remove stereotypes, through intervention field experiments where you remove stereotypes through interventions, women and minority students perform better than men and non-minorities with the same prior grades and test scores. That is, if you look at men and women who had the same SAT math scores, and you bring them in and you have them take a math test, and you have them take that math test in a condition that removes stereotype threat, on average, the woman does better. And her better performance indexes the amount by which that prior score, that prior SAT math score, underestimated her math ability. If you compare white students and black students in college GPA, and you look at them as their performance, and you look at students who have the same high school grades and the same college board scores, and you look at them in an environment in which you have actively removed stereotype threat, on average, black students get a better GPA. And that indexes the amount by which the prior grades and test scores underestimated black students' ability, and it's because they're running into a psychological headwind. This is what's called the latent ability effect. The idea is that ability is not fully indexed in common performance metrics, grades and test scores. That part of the ability of women and African Americans and Latinos, low social class students who face stereotypes is latent, is not present in their scores. And this carries a very important policy implication, and that is that in some sense, affirmative action and meritocracy are the same thing. That is, in some settings, in order to introduce a true meritocracy, in order to implement a system in which people are truly evaluated as a function of their merits and potential, we have to take groups into account. We have to take into account people's gender or racial ethnic groups, because if we didn't, we'd be discriminating against the woman or against the ethnic minority student. So the bottom line, psychological processes are essential to many social problems, including inequality in education and in health, many others. And understanding these processes can help inform novel, effective remedies to solve them. OK, I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to talking.
So I want to start off with a question that actually I've asked you before, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it in much detail. So before Greg joined the faculty at Stanford, he actually served for a year working with Hillary Clinton as a, legislative fellow in Congress. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us what it was like to be a kind of science advisor or policy advisor for Hillary, and do they actually use science when they're shaping and voting on policy?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. It was a terrific and wonderful experience. I was a legislative fellow on the legislative team, so we handled the team as a whole, handled all legislation for the senator. I was on the children and families team. We called ourselves informally Team Kids, which meant we handled all things related to kids. Yes, science does matter in policy settings. One of the senator's long-standing interests is in children. She has an interest in that dating back to her days at Yale Law School when she worked in child development, and she has a great deal of expertise in it. The particular issues that were pressing at the time in the legislative calendar were ones that involved children in media, children in especially electronic media, as video games, for example, for babies have come out. There's been growing questions about maybe what might be the effects of those video games on children and children's development. There's a lot of research in psychology on some of these questions. For example, it is now known unequivocally that violent media, exposure to violent media, causes children to become more violent and aggressive. There is no doubt about that causal relationship after decades of research. I say that strongly, by the way, because a review article by the leading researchers in this area said in the abstract that the scientific debate about whether violent media causes violent behavior in children is over. So this is a very strong evidence base. And somebody said it's surprising. It was when I went to graduate school, I was dubious of this, and then I started to read the evidence, and it is very clear. There was a lot of concern about what video games were doing to children, what so-called educational games, Baby Einstein, which had a lawsuit a few years ago. And,
is that because it didn't turn babies into Einstein?
It didn't turn babies into Einsteins, yeah. It turned out to not be an accurate marketing claim.
Sorry.
So the Senator had a couple of bills, and one of them was a very bipartisan bill. It was called CAMERA. It was a Children in Media Research Advancement Act. And it was a bill that was co-sponsored by the most conservative members of the Senate, including Senator Brownback from Kansas, Senator Santorum from Pennsylvania. Joe Lieberman was on it as well as a moderate, and then Senator Clinton. And what was interesting to me in terms of the intersection of science and that particular policy issue was that this was a bipartisan bill that was very sincerely supported by these 4 members of Congress. It ultimately passed Congress and is part of the law today. But they came to it from very different perspectives and for very different reasons. Senator Clinton is very empirically minded and was very sensitive to evidence and to scientific evidence and very interested in that. And for her, this was sort of a pragmatic question of child development and how we could understand the effects of these things, how we could get more information to parents so they could control what their children would be exposed to. For the more conservative members of this particular legislative group, it was a less empirical and more ideological perspective that led to the same policy. So the conservative members tended more to talk about in sort of more strongly, overtly moral terms about the filth of violence in the media and the filth of exposing that to young, impressionable children. So one of the things I learned throughout that experience was how many different influences there are on these major legislative and policy issues. Science is one of them, but there are others. There are value-laden perspectives. Of course, there are legal, procedural, other kinds of issues. And science is a player, but one of many players.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Very interesting. So you've been outspoken in your belief that psychology should be used to design interventions, and actually co-authored a very interesting position paper arguing to psychologists, you need to get in the game, folks, and study these problems and design interventions. So I was wondering if you could tell us what you think that psychology can offer, maybe some other interventions that you appreciate, maybe ones you didn't design yourself, or problems where you think we have some research or some theories that could be turned into interventions. So let's start with education more broadly.
Yeah, sure. So this is obviously an intervention that's directly related to education, but the work of Carol Dweck, my colleague.
Who's going to be speaking here in a couple weeks?
She has shown very beautifully how students come into school sometimes with assumptions about the nature of intelligence, that some kids just assume as a consequence of being in our culture that intelligence is fixed, that you either have it or you don't, you're either smart or you're not, you're either talented or you're not. And how students who have these theories can look very similar to other students who believe that intelligence is something you can grow and build in times when everybody's doing well. But when you encounter failure, when something bad happens, when you fail a test, for example, if you believe that that test diagnoses you as not intelligent, then the response is to just give up, to stop trying, because why would you keep trying if you don't have what it takes? So that's a line of research that has been very important and influential for me personally and for the field broadly, and is important for education and child development as well.
Do you think there's anything in education reform or policy right now that is absolutely unsupported by the evidence?
I'm sure there are many things. I mean, there. Yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of sort of big policy issues in education now, and there are sort of education is politically an odd thing where there are these movements, for example, where this is the next new thing that's going to solve all of our problems. In NCLB, it was testing. We're going to test everybody to death, and then we're going to know how to fix all the problems, and that's clearly not worked. There's sort of growing movement for charter schools. Charter schools, get the school boards out of the way. That's going to solve everything. That clearly doesn't work as a cure-all. So I think that what we need to do is to understand the causal dynamics that contribute to positive educational outcomes in a much more complicated way. That's why I wanted to emphasize at the end that this is not a silver bullet. Psychological interventions as a whole class can't solve educational problems, because we need to understand that if a kid's going to do well in school, there's going to be a whole lot of factors that have to come together for that to happen. That is, the teacher has to be a good teacher. She has to be well supported and feel positive, and she has to have, curricula that she can deliver that's going to be appropriate to the student. There has to be materials that is age appropriate for the student. The student can't be being harassed. The student can't be, go to class hungry. The student can't be experiencing subtle psychological threats. There's a lot of things that are required to really optimize development and optimize learning and growth. And so I think that we need to resist sort of cure-all approaches, whether they're psychological interventions or testing or charter schools. I think we need to be more sensitive to the complexity.
Now, you don't just study academic performance in college students. You also teach undergraduates. Greg is one of our core lecturers for the Introduction to Psychology program, so he has the opportunity to interface with undergraduates often in their very first year at Stanford. And I'm wondering how either your own research or other psychological theories influence how you teach in the classroom.
Yeah, I think that one answer to that goes back to Carol Dweck's research. And it's very easy to see in a setting a fixed mindset sort of rear its ugly head. It has a way of popping up. We do an annual day, an orientation day in Psych 1 with the faculty and our Psych 1 research team and Psych 1, not research team, teaching team, and the teaching assistants, undergraduates, graduate students, people who work throughout the year to deliver Psych 1 as a class to undergraduates. And a couple of years ago, we noticed as a faculty that somehow, we asked people at the beginning to think about teaching that was important and impactful for them, teachers who made a difference in their lives, and the teaching assistants told these wonderful stories. And at the end of the day, we sort of realized that there had been this undercurrent of this belief that there's such a thing as a fixed teacher. That is, that some teachers are good teachers, and they have what it takes. They have that thing, and it was this fixed mindset that we hadn't intended, that we hadn't endorsed, but had sort of percolated up from our collective conscience. And so now I think we're mindful of that, and we explicitly try in thinking about teaching and working with TAs who are going to be leading seminars with students to really endorse explicitly the notion of growth, the notion of improvability, the notion that you try something, you see if it works. If it doesn't work, you find a new strategy. You're active in your growing of your teaching. So I think in many contexts in our lives, a fixed theory can become, and we have to resist that. Carol Dweck's research really beautifully attunes us to that.
So let's switch over to public health or physical health in general. What are your favorite interventions that are based on psychological theory, or what theories do you think could be turned into interventions?
Yeah, there's so many psychological. Psychology is so important in health, and there's so many possible answers to that. There's research. One of my favorite studies, a classic work in psychology, showed. This was work done in the 1970s. Work done in retirement homes that showed that people who the assumption at the time was that if you move into a retirement home, you lose your independence somewhat, and people can lose a sense of control over their lives. That is, it can no longer feel like you can control important things. Research showed that even subtle interventions that were designed to make it clear to people, residents of retirement homes, that they had control over important aspects of their lives, actually improved the health and well-being of residents of retirement homes. There's a dark side, though, to this story. There's a couple of different studies that tried to do this and did this effectively in the short term, but one of the studies had a negative consequence. And I think this illustrates the subtlety and importance of thinking about psychology. I think you know which one I'm talking about. This was a study in which the retirement home residents had visits from young college students. And the retirement home residents, in one condition, could control when these college students would come to visit them and for how long they would stay. This was designed to instantiate this sense of being able to control things in your life, to make sure that that was there for these people. Other residents were given the same amount of visiting, and they could predict when the visits would happen, but they couldn't control them. Other people got random visits, again, the same length of visits, but they couldn't control or predict. So this is absent the control and prediction. And then some people just got no visits at all. And in the short term, the first two groups, the group that had control and the group that could predict, did really well. They had this great measure of how much zest for life does the resident have, and they had a lot of zest for life, okay? But the problem was that then the college students, they went home. They went home for summer break. And then there were no more visits. And then they did a long-term follow-up. And to the author's great credit, he published the data from this long-term follow-up. And what you see is that the two groups of residents who had the control and the predict, they actually looked the worst on the long-term follow-up. They thought they could control something, but they couldn't. And in fact, there wasn't that long of a follow-up. There weren't that many people who passed away during the study. But nobody in the random visits and the no visits group passed away, and several people in the other groups did pass away. And that was an effect that approached statistical significance. So we need to be. That's an important variable. The sense of being able to control things in your life. It's important for our health. But we need to be very mindful of how we instill that and whether we can instill that in a way that has effects that have duration. That's an old study from the 1970s.
And I think what I love about that story is that it demonstrates the values of science. That, if this were maybe a political issue, that could have been swept under the rug.
Yeah.
But that, scientists have the values to publish it so that people can learn from it.
Yeah, you can imagine being that author who believes this theory, writes this beautiful paper showing these positive effects, and then thinks, I'm going to follow it up long term and show these continued positive effects, and then sees this revert. You can imagine what that was like. I think he must have lost a lot of sleep.
And there have been some other famous studies like that, too, in psychology, where there was a really positive finding in the beginning and it didn't pan out. Here at Stanford, we had that study, was it in the early 80s or the late 80s, that women who were receiving treatment for breast cancer, who were in a social support group, that they lived longer. And then every attempt to replicate that didn't find the findings.
Yeah, I'm no expert in that. I know some people say that failure to replicate is because the original study got so much publicity that now it's sort of gospel. If you have breast cancer, you should get support groups. So, but
yes,
we don't know. Yeah.
Lots of hypotheses about why. But It's been interesting to see how scientists will, in fact, publish the fact they have not been able to replicate findings that got them tenure and got them funding. So one last question before I turn it over. So you've shown me some of the hate mail that you've received for studies like the ones that you talked about today, including the stereotype threat and the stereotype lift. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about why it is that this research is so threatening to people, or what effect that has on you.
Yeah. So the research that provokes people the most is the very last stuff that I shared with you, the latent ability stuff, because white people, men primarily, respond to that by thinking that I'm telling them that they're less smart than they thought they were. It's really interesting. It's as though I'm not saying that, first of all, just to. But it's very interesting, though. I think that we, in some sense, carry around these credentials, like our SAT score, as though it has this long, enduring, deep meaning, and it's a badge of our membership in the smart class and our membership in good society. And the notion that something like a test score is constructed, and it's constructed in a social circumstance, and this circumstance affects how well people perform, and it might be biased to some degree, is one that's very threatening for people. And what we know in psychology is that when an idea or a belief is threatening, when we don't want to believe it, we engage in motivated reasoning. We reason in ways that are motivated to achieve a certain conclusion, and so people can be very resistant.
So We're eager to hear your questions. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay.
And we have a question in the front row that actually is a really great question to start us off with. So, and then just pick people, and I'll let you know when we're running out of time.
Well, I have lots of other questions now, but I'll go back to the question you mentioned, Kelly, which was you led us down to realize how truly important that hour-long intervention was in the life of these students. I was wondering if you could just go back and tell us a little bit more about that hour.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So people are told, this is a study of students' college experiences and attitudes, and they're brought into a psychology laboratory in this particular study. We've done this intervention in a number of contexts. It's not always exactly the same. I'll just tell you the original. They come into the psychology laboratory. They're told, we're really trying to understand students' college experiences, what it's like to be a college student. And we've collected some preliminary survey data from upperclassmen. But because you are a freshman who's going through the transition to college right now, you are an expert in these things. And so we're going to want to hear what you have to say and what your experiences have been like. And so then the students read these materials from upperclassmen. They read survey statistics, and they read 9 quotations. And then we say, as you know, it can be very difficult to go into a new situation when you don't know what to expect. It can be very difficult to come to college when you don't know what to expect. So we want to use this to try to help better inform next year's freshmen. So now what we want you to do is we want you to write an essay about why you think people's experiences in college change over time the way they do. Why do people worry at first about their belonging, but come to feel at home in college over time? And please illustrate your essay with examples from your own experience and your transition to college. You can look back on these intervention materials as you wish. And then they have about 25 minutes or so, and they write these essays. These are very moving essays. They're very personal. People don't use their names, but they tell personal stories. Some of them are very funny. One student I remember wrote about how she was a freshman and she came to freshman orientation, and the dean stood up and the dean said, "Our class is so wonderful. We have so many smart people here. We have people who are Olympic athletes. We have people here who are novelists. We have a student who has a book about Russian philosophy." And the participating student thinks, "God, I'm none of those things. You know, who am I, right? Like, this is not my class, right?" And she's writing this essay, though, and then she writes that she ultimately, in her freshman year, she's writing at the end of her freshman year, over the course of her freshman year, she met one of these students, particularly the Russian philosophy book writer. She met him at a party, and after the party, she saw him peeing on a wall outside the party. And she said, "No longer is he intimidating." So it took the power out of it, right? So this is a story that she told that illustrated this feeling, these worries. I don't know what this place is. I don't know if I belong here. But then over time, coming to feel at home in the place, coming to feel it was her school, her environment. So students write the essays, then we say, we think it'd be especially powerful for next year's freshmen if they feel as though an older student is speaking directly to them about their experiences, how their experiences change over time. Would you be so kind as to deliver your essay as a speech to a video camera? And the participants are then given some additional time to revise their essay, prepare for the speech. They come into another room. There's a big video camera. They deliver their speech. That is effectively the entire intervention. In other studies, we have used, we've had people take part in groups. In some studies, we've had people write letters to a freshman instead of having to deliver a speech. It's a lot more of a portable technology. So, does that answer the question? Thanks. Yeah?
Have you done your study at a predominantly black college or a Hispanic college? And if so, how did the data change, if it did?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we haven't done this intervention at a predominantly black college. And related interventions, which you might think would have less effect in a predominantly black setting, that is, a setting where people presumably have less reason to worry about these issues as a function of their race, have in some cases had positive effects. The jury is effectively still out, though. We don't know what the effects would be like in lots of different contexts, especially in this context. There is we do have another study, though, that speaks to this issue, where this was a study done of women in engineering at a university engineering program. The students were entered the program in their first year in the engineering program with a major already. They applied to the major itself. And we delivered an intervention like the belonging intervention and another intervention. And then we looked at how the intervention's effects affected women's grades in engineering as a function of their major. And what we found was that for women who were in gender-diverse majors, there was no effect. For women who were in male-dominated majors, the interventions eliminated a large gender gap in first-year GPA. So my expectation is that interventions like this will be most reliable and effective in settings in which people are in diverse environments where their identity is potentially at risk and potentially under suspicion. But there are some cases in which interventions like this have been effective, even in homogeneously black settings, for example, in inner city Chicago. And so there may be broader potential. Yeah.
You talked about interventions that eliminate gaps. You do studies on motivation, on elevating levels of motivation within student course?
Yeah. So, is the question, can you do a study on interventions to increase people's motivation? Yeah. So there are certainly. So this intervention, in a sense, is one that's designed to remove a barrier so that people can exhibit the motivation they are assumed to already have, right? But you certainly can do interventions that would increase people's motivation in settings, for example, where they might lack motivation. And there are a number of different examples in the field of factors that are important for motivation that you can target to potentially improve outcomes. Yeah, in the back.
So the student is making a faulty inference about their situation. I can see how the intervention can make a big difference. What about when they truly are in a hostile?
Yeah. What if the student really is in a hostile setting? So first of all, I want to answer your question in two parts. First, it's not necessarily the case that students are making an inaccurate inference. I think the problem is that the world is very ambiguous and complicated, and it's not clear. There might not be a sort of single truth or a simple truth. That is, if a black student, for example, sends an email to a peer and doesn't get a response back, might that potentially mean that they don't belong there? Might there not be racial bias that's causing that to happen? There might be. We don't know. We couldn't say. So just to sort of say, I think that the reason why the intervention is effective and the reason why the psychology is so acute is because it's so ambiguous. It's not at all clear what you should be doing or thinking. Now the question is, what do you do in an environment in which it's just actually hostile? And you certainly wouldn't want to do this intervention in that environment. There are other interventions that are designed to help people continue to feel good and feel positive and be able to do well even despite threats or psychological threats that are directed towards them. And those interventions might be more effective in those settings. It could also be that you say, you know what, this is a crappy place, and the first thing to do is improve this place. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do things to reduce people's levels of bias. For example, more sexist men interact with women in engineering contexts in sort of flirtatious and dominant ways. They open their legs up, they lean forward, and that causes women to experience threat. And that threat causes women to do badly in engineering. And if you could do an intervention on the men to make the men be less boorish, you could probably improve women's outcomes. Somebody from this side of the room? Yeah, in the back?
I have a question about this one topic you just touched on called stereotype lifting, which is the flip side. And wondered, a couple of charts indicated there's sort of a leveling or almost a zero-sum effect happening when you remove the lifting. But enhance the performance of the group that's being adversely impacted. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum because the stereotype threat effect is about twice as large as the stereotype lift effect. But you're absolutely right that they're working in tandem, so that when you remove the stereotype, so let me just distinguish, first of all, this is in the laboratory research. This is not in the field research. But in the laboratory research, conditions that elicit stereotype threat, for example, for women in math or for African Americans in intelligence settings, or, by the way, for white men in jumping contexts and others, that undermine people's performance. Emotional sensitivity settings, you tell men that a task evaluates their emotional sensitivity, suddenly they can't perform well. That negative effect is about twice as large as the corresponding stereotype lift effect, that is the positive effect for men's math performance, for whites' intellectual ability, for African Americans jumping. So the stereotype is causing inequality in both ways. To remove the stereotype is to improve overall performance because stereotype threat is bigger than stereotype lift. But it's true that in the laboratory you are then hurting the advantaged group. In the field settings, these interventions generally just have no effect on the non-stereotyped group. Yeah.
Somewhere in this review, Jäger and Walton, you say it's important the duration of the intervention is if it's too long, it can have a negative effect. Like in the example, when students get reprimanded for abuse of alcohol, if the speech is only 5 minutes, it's more effective than 50 minutes. Can you say a bit more about this timing?
Yeah, I mean, there's this sort of thou doth protest too much quality sometimes. You're trying to change people's psychology. You're trying to make them think differently, but you also want them to feel as though the message is not coercive. That they themselves endorse the idea and endorse the intervention message. If you keep beating somebody over the head with believe this, believe this, believe this, even if they kind of wanted to believe it the first time, ultimately they might not want to believe it. So changing people's psychology is sometimes subtle and requires a subtle touch.
Greg, one more question?
Okay, yeah.
Has there been any longitudinal study that as the representation has increased, whether the negative stereotypical impact has reached? I mean, women in engineering, as the percentage has increased, as the gap increased?
Yeah, there's a lot of research that suggests that general pattern, but none of it is obviously experimental, right? Because you're not randomly. I mean, there is experimental laboratory research that shows that people experience stereotype threat when they're, for example, the only person in their group among a large group of others. But and that you can reduce that threat by increasing the diversity of that setting. And then there's a lot of sort of field observational data that suggests that that's true in the field too. But obviously in the field you can't randomly assign people to context like that. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Next week we're going to have Professor James Gross talking about different strategies for handling difficult emotions like anger and fear. If you were one of those no email people, come see me. Have a great week.
Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.